A family thought they knew the man they buried, until a stranger's child spoke at his funeral. The sky was heavy with grey clouds, the kind that made everything feel colder than it actually was. The air smelled of damp earth and wilting flowers as the crowd gathered around the open grave. It was a quiet funeral, the kind where no one spoke unless they had to. David Reynolds had been a healthy man, or so everyone thought. His sudden passing in his sleep had left his family shattered. His wife, Victoria, stood motionless, her hands gripping the folded funeral program so tightly it crumpled in her grasp. Next to her, their 16-year-old daughter, Evelyn, kept her eyes fixed on the casket. She hadn't shed a single tear in public, but her clenched jaw said enough. Behind them, David's parents, Richard and Margaret Reynolds, stood with an air of quiet dignity. Richard's expression was stone cold, while Margaret, in her black lace gloves, dabbed at her dry eyes with a tissue. The pastor spoke, his voice low and steady, but the words barely registered. Everyone here was lost in their own grief, except for one small voice that cut through the silence. "Daddy." Heads turned. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Victoria's grip on the funeral program loosened. Evelyn blinked. Margaret's breath hitched. And then they saw him. A small black boy, no older than 2, stood a few feet away, his tiny finger pointed at the casket. His curls were thick, his deep brown eyes wide with confusion. He wasn't crying, just staring, as if waiting for his father to wake up. Beside him a woman stood frozen. Monica Carter. She looked as if she hadn't meant to be seen. Her fingers clutched the little boy's shoulder, as if she were holding him back from stepping any closer. Her black dress was simple, unassuming, but her eyes held something no one in David's family had ever seen before. Fear. The air grew thick. The silence was unbearable. Then the child spoke again. "Daddy, wake up." A choked gasp came from somewhere in the crowd. Victoria took a slow, unsteady step back. Evelyn's fingers curled into fists. Richard's posture stiffened. Margaret's lips parted, but no words came out. The resemblance was unmistakable. The same nose, the same shape of the eyes, the same dimples David had when he smiled. The little boy wasn't just some child. He was David's child. But no one had ever heard of him. No one had ever seen him. And in that moment, standing beside the grave of the man who had kept this secret, the Reynolds family realized they didn't know David as well as they thought. But the real question was, why? But before anyone could speak, the weight of the moment crashed down, forcing them to confront a truth none of them were ready for. For a moment, no one moved. The world seemed to have stopped, frozen in the weight of what had just been revealed. Victoria felt her chest tighten as she stared at the little boy, her mind racing for an explanation. A misunderstanding. A mistake. But the resemblance was too strong to deny. Her husband, her David, had a child with another woman. Margaret's breathing turned shallow, her gloved hand trembling as she reached for Richard's arm. But Richard Reynolds didn't move. His face was unreadable, his jaw locked so tightly his teeth might crack. The other mourners had started whispering. Quiet, hushed tones of disbelief, of judgment, of curiosity. The perfect Reynolds family wasn't so perfect anymore. Then, Evelyn broke the silence. She took a single step toward the child, her voice barely above a whisper. Who are you?" The boy didn't answer. He only looked up at his mother. Monica Carter finally found her voice. It was soft, yet firm, carrying an exhaustion that had clearly weighed on her long before today. "His name is Jalen." Silence. Monica's eyes scanned the family. Victoria, Evelyn, Richard, Margaret, all of them looking at her like she had just ripped the ground from beneath their feet. She tightened her grip on her son, her pulse hammering. She hadn't planned on this. She wasn't supposed to be seen. She only wanted Jalen to say goodbye. But now, there was no walking away. Margaret's voice was sharp when she finally spoke. "Is this some kind of joke?" Monica's expression didn't change. "No, ma'am." Victoria's lips quivered as she looked at Monica, then back at Jalen. The weight of betrayal pressed against her ribs. "How long?" Her voice wavered. "How long have you been with my husband?" Monica's chest ached at the accusation. She had expected this. "I was never with him the way you think," she said carefully. "We knew each other years ago. Before your marriage." Victoria's breath hitched. Her head shook slowly, her thoughts unraveling. "He would have told me." "He wouldn't." She stopped. "But would he?" Evelyn stared at Jalen, her throat tightening. David was her father, but he had another child, a son, a brother she never knew about. Jalen, oblivious to the tension, was still watching the casket. Then he whispered something that shattered what was left of the moment. "Daddy was frayed." The words hit like a hammer. Victoria's fingers dug into her palms. Richard inhaled sharply. Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. Afraid? David was afraid. Afraid of what? Afraid of them. The funeral had turned into something else entirely. A reckoning. But before anyone could ask what he meant, the answer was already hanging in the air, too obvious and too painful to ignore. The wind picked up, rustling the trees as the weight of Jalen's words settled over the group like a heavy fog. Daddy was frayed. Victoria swallowed hard. Afraid of what? Of them. Her eyes darted to Monica, searching for something, an explanation, a lie, anything that would make this make sense. But Monica wasn't offering her a way out. She just stood there, holding Jalen close, her expression unreadable. Margaret was the first to crack. She let out a sharp breath, her voice trembling. "This is ridiculous. David wasn't afraid of anything. He was a grown man." Monica's gaze flicked to her, and for the first time since she spoke, there was something else in her eyes. Sadness. Maybe even pity. "He was afraid of losing you," Monica said quietly. "Afraid of your judgment. Afraid of what you would have done if you knew about Jalen." The words stung. They didn't want to believe it, but deep down they already knew it was true. Richard cleared his throat, but his voice was tight. "That's not fair." Monica tilted her head slightly, her tone calm but firm. "Isn't it?" A thick silence followed. Victoria's pulse was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. She couldn't take her eyes off the little boy standing next to Monica, David's son. She tried to picture her husband keeping this secret. Coming home every night, acting like nothing was wrong, like there wasn't a whole child out there who looked just like him. She tried to imagine the kind of man who could do that. But then another thought hit her. David wasn't that kind of man. If he had kept this a secret, it wasn't because he didn't love Jalen. It wasn't because he was ashamed. It was because of them. Margaret's sharp tone cut through the silence. "So what? You expect us to believe that David, our David, was scared of his own family?" Monica let out a slow breath, shaking her head slightly. "You don't have to believe it. But he did." Evelyn shifted, her voice quiet. "But why?" Monica hesitated. She could have sugar-coated it. She could have softened the truth. But what would be the point? David was gone. The lie was already shattered. So she said it plainly. "Because he knew you wouldn't accept his son." The words hit like a slap. Margaret flinched. Richard's lips parted as if to argue. But no words came. Victoria sucked in a breath, her face paling. Evelyn's fingers twitched. She knew her family. She knew the way they talked behind closed doors, the way their polite smiles in public didn't always match their whispered conversations at home. And suddenly, she saw her father differently. Not as the man who lied to them, but as the man who thought he had no choice. A lump formed in Victoria's throat. Did David die carrying that burden? Did the stress of keeping this secret, keeping his own son hidden, contribute to his death? She didn't know. She would never know. And that thought made her sick. But before anyone could fully process the guilt settling in, the past came rushing back, bringing with it the truth they had spent years refusing to face. The cemetery was quiet, except for the rustling of leaves and the occasional sniffle from the gathered mourners. But within the Reynolds family, a storm was raging. Victoria swallowed hard, her throat dry. "You're telling me my husband, the man I shared a life with, hid his son from me because he was afraid of my reaction?" Monica's gaze didn't waver. "Yes." Victoria flinched, as if the truth physically struck her. She wanted to deny it. Wanted to believe David had been the coward, not her. But deep down she knew. She knew what her family was. Margaret scoffed, crossing her arms tightly. "That's absurd. We're not those kinds of people." Monica let out a short breath, almost a laugh, but there was no humor in it. "Aren't you?" Richard tensed beside Margaret, but he didn't argue. Evelyn just stared at the ground, her mind flashing back to the conversation she wasn't supposed to overhear. The Thanksgiving dinners where her grandparents casually mentioned keeping the family name pure. The times her mother whispered about the wrong crowd when talking about her classmates. The way her father would sigh, exhausted, every time he had to change the subject. Evelyn's stomach twisted. How had she never noticed before? Victoria shook her head, her voice hoarse. "David loved his family." Monica's lips parted, and for the first time, her expression cracked. "And yet, he spent 2 years pretending his son didn't exist." Silence. Jalen fidgeted beside her, tugging at her dress, but she couldn't take her eyes off Victoria. "Do you know what it was like for him?" Monica's voice was softer now, but it carried years of pain. "He used to sit on my couch, staring at his phone, trying to figure out how to tell you. He wanted Jalen to know his family, but every time he thought about what you might say, he shut down." Victoria's breath hitched. "He wanted to tell you," Monica whispered, "but he didn't trust you with his son." Margaret let out a frustrated sigh. David was a grown man. He could have made his own choices. Monica turned her sharp gaze toward her. "And what would you have said, Margaret?" Margaret hesitated. Monica took a slow step forward. "If David had come to you, your perfect, successful white son, and said, 'Mum, I have a child. He's black. I love him,' what would you have said?" Margaret's lips parted, but no words came out. Because she knew. She knew exactly what she would have said. The same thing her parents had said to her when she was young. The same thing she had instilled in her own son. And for the first time in her life, Margaret Reynolds felt ashamed. Victoria sucked in a breath, her hands shaking. "He never even gave us a chance." Monica's eyes turned cold. "He knew you didn't deserve one." Victoria's stomach lurched. David was gone. She would never get to prove him wrong, and that realization would haunt her forever. But before the guilt could fully settle in, there was one last choice to make, one that would define what kind of people the Reynolds family truly were. The wind carried the scent of damp earth and fresh flowers, but all Victoria could smell was regret. Her legs felt unsteady, her heartbeat thundering in her ears. David was gone. There would be no second chances, no explanations, no long conversations where they worked through this together. He had made his choice. He had taken this secret to his grave, leaving them to deal with the aftermath. Evelyn shifted beside her, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. She hadn't said much, but her silence was loud. Too loud. Jalen, unaware of the weight of his existence in this moment, looked up at Victoria. His big brown eyes, the same shade as David's, blinked at her, unbothered, unafraid. And just like that, she saw what David must have seen. He wasn't a scandal, he wasn't a mistake. He was just a little boy, her husband's son. Victoria sucked in a breath. "What do you want from us?" Her voice was quiet, fragile. Monica, still holding Jalen close, didn't hesitate. Nothing. That answer should have been a relief, but it wasn't. Victoria looked at the little boy again, something in her chest tightening. Jalen had no idea he was standing in front of his father's family. No idea they were supposed to love him. Supposed to. Evelyn took a step forward, her voice shaky. "Do you want him to know us?" Monica hesitated. The truth was, she hadn't planned on it. David had made his choice clear. He wanted to protect Jalen from the same people who were now standing in front of him, pretending they didn't understand why he was afraid. But David was gone. And Jalen was just a child. She exhaled, carefully choosing her words. "I want him to know the part of his father that loved him." Margaret flinched. The implication was clear. Jalen deserved to know his father. But the rest of them, they had to prove they were worth knowing. Evelyn's throat tightened. She glanced at her mother, her grandparents. Were they worth knowing? Margaret lowered her gaze, for once, at a loss for words. Richard let out a slow breath, but his face was unreadable. But Victoria was breaking apart. She had spent so many years believing she knew her husband inside and out. But here she was, standing in front of his son for the first time. A son he never trusted her to accept. And suddenly, she wasn't just mourning David anymore. She was mourning the life she could have had, the one David never believed she was capable of. But the funeral was over. The casket was in the ground. The only thing left was the choice. Would they walk away from Jalen like David had feared? Or would they prove him wrong? The funeral was ending. The casket had been lowered, and people were starting to drift away, murmuring condolences that now felt empty. But the Reynolds family was still standing there, frozen in the weight of a decision they never expected to make. Jalen tugged at Monica's dress, fidgeting in the way toddlers do when they're ready to leave. He had no idea that his mere existence had cracked open decades of buried truths. Monica sighed and adjusted his little coat. "Come on, baby. It's time to go." She turned, prepared to walk away. Because that's what she had always expected, to do this alone. But then Evelyn stepped forward. "Wait." Monica stopped but didn't turn around. She didn't want to hope. Hope had only ever led to disappointment. Evelyn swallowed hard, glancing at her mother and grandparents. Then she lowered herself to Jalen's height. "Hey," she said softly. "My name's Evelyn." Jalen blinked up at her, curious. Evelyn hesitated, then reached into her pocket. She pulled out a small silver bracelet, David's. She had taken it from his dresser the night he died, keeping it as a piece of him she could hold on to. She looked at Jalen again, then gently held out the bracelet. "This belonged to your dad." Jalen didn't understand the full meaning, but he reached out, gripping the bracelet in his tiny hand. Monica inhaled sharply. And then, Evelyn looked at her mother. Victoria was staring, eyes glassy, lips pressed together so tightly they were turning white. For the first time since this all started, she looked at Jalen like a person. Not a mistake, not a scandal, a person. And it hurt. It hurt because she realized she could have loved him. She should have loved him. She had failed David in ways she never could have imagined. And now, the only thing she could do was try. If Monica would let her. Victoria's throat felt tight, her voice barely above a whisper. Can we see him again? Monica studied her carefully. Victoria didn't deserve trust yet. But maybe Jalen did deserve family. She gave a small nod. Maybe. Margaret and Richard remained silent, but Evelyn. She smiled. Jalen gripped the bracelet tightly, glancing up at his newfound sister. The wind carried the last words spoken at the grave. Words of regret. Words of change. David Reynolds was gone. But his son was still here. And now it was up to them to decide what that meant. Because at the end of the day, family isn't just about blood. It's about what you do with the love you're given, and the love you choose to give back. If this story made you think, if it made you question, then share it. Because sometimes, the hardest truths are the ones that change us the most.